Yeah, we've got a couple of quizzes for you today, too. All right, good afternoon. Starting off with a programming note. On Monday, 10 a.m., there will be the fourth session of the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent that will kick off here at UN headquarters under the theme Africa and People of African Descent, United for Reparatory Justice in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. We will have the chef de cabinet, Courtenay Rattray, will deliver the Secretary General's remarks. Over 1,000 participants have registered to attend the session, which will continue until Thursday next week. There will be discussions about reparatory justice for Africa and people of African descent, human rights of women and girls of African descent, policy making and systematic racism, digital justice, as well as on the bicentennial of the Haitian independence debt. Side events and cultural performances are also planned. A report on the forum will be presented to both the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly later this year. And as usual, the meetings will all be broadcast on the UN webcast platform. Turning to Myanmar, and just 2 weeks after the country was hit by two devastating earthquakes, we and our partners launched a $275 million appeal, which is an addendum to the 2025 Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan to reach 1.1 million people with urgent aid and assistance. The earthquake have pushed 2 million people into critical need of assistance and protection. That's in addition to the 19.9 million human beings in Myanmar who were estimated to need humanitarian aid prior to this disaster. UN agencies and partners and member states have rapidly mobilized aid, including medical care, shelter, safe water, hygiene kits, and food. To further strengthen efforts on the ground, we and the UN Central Emergency Fund has allocated an additional $5 million for the earthquake response, on top of the $5 million already provided a few weeks ago. And the UN Human Rights Office today said that civilians are continuing to suffer as military operations persist, despite ceasefires declared after last month's tragic earthquake. At a moment when the sole focus should be on ensuring humanitarian aid gets to disaster zones, the military in Myanmar is instead launching attacks. That was what our human rights colleagues said. The High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, called on the military to remove any and all obstacles to the delivery of humanitarian assistance and to, of course, cease military operations. Moving to the situation in Gaza, our humanitarian colleagues tell us that earlier today, Israeli authorities issued 2 new displacement orders covering vast areas in northern and southern Gaza. Together, they span more than 24 square kilometers, roughly the size of everything south of Central Park here in Manhattan. Several medical facilities and storage sites containing critical supplies are located within newly designated displacement zones, and OCHA warns that this could have life-threatening consequences for people in urgent need of care. With this latest development, OCHA reports that more than 2/3 of the Gaza Strip is either under active displacement orders or designated as no-go zones. That's areas where humanitarian teams are required to coordinate their movements with Israeli authorities. This leaves Palestinians with less than 1/3 of Gaza's area to live in, and that remaining space is fragmented. It's unsafe, and it's barely livable following 18 months of hostilities, which is ongoing. Overcrowded shelters are in terrible conditions. Service providers are struggling to operate, and resources are being depleted. The UN Human Rights Office today said that the nature and the scope of the Israeli evacuation orders in Gaza raised serious concerns that Israel intends to permanently remove the civilian population from these areas in order to create a, quote, buffer zone. OCHA reminds us that today marks 40 days since Israeli authorities imposed a full closure on the entry of cargo into Gaza, and since then, no one, including we, our humanitarian partners, have been permitted to bring in supplies, regardless of how critically needed those items may be. Everything is running extremely low. Bakeries have shut down. Life-saving medicines have run out. and water production has been drastically reduced. Israel, as the occupying power, as the Secretary General said last week, has clear earlier this week, has clear obligations under international law, and these include ensuring that food, that medical supplies, and public health services are available. Meanwhile, Gaza, attacks across Gaza continue unabated. In the recent days, OCHA has received reports that several humanitarian assets and their immediate surroundings have been hit. These include a clinic, a water tanker, and tents sheltering displaced families. Windows of a UN guest house were also damaged. At the same time, Israeli authorities continue to deny our efforts to coordinate movements. Yesterday and today, 6 out of 10 such attempts were blocked outright. The few movements that were facilitated involve only staff, not the delivery of aid. And turning to the West Bank, in its regular reporting, OCHA points to ongoing violence, destruction, and displacement in many areas. In just 2 weeks, that's the last week of March and the first week of April, Israeli forces killed 9 Palestinians, including 2 children, and injured at least 130. During the same time, OCHA documented demolition of more than 100 structures across the West Bank for lacking Israeli-issued building permits, which are nearly impossible to obtain. This led to the displacement of more than 120 Palestinians, mostly children, and otherwise affected over 200 people. Turning to Syria, our colleagues at the UN Refugee Agency say that some 400,000 Syrians have now returned from neighboring countries since the fall of Bashar al-Assad. During the same period, more than 1 million internally displaced people within Syria have returned home, bringing the total number of Syrians who've gone home to more than 1.4 million. UNHCR stressed that to make these returns successful and sustainable, Syrians will need support with shelter, livelihoods, protection, and legal assistance. UNHCR noted that severe funding cuts that it is facing are putting millions of lives at risk. Nearly 16.7 million people inside Syria, that's about 90% of the population, require some form of humanitarian assistance, and more than 7.4 million Syrians are still displaced within their own country. And today, our friend Volker Turk, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, said that the warring parties in Sudan are overseeing a wholesale assault on human rights amidst global inaction with deeply catastrophic consequences for civilians, stressing that 2 years into this brutal and senseless conflict, this must be a wake-up call to the parties to lay down their weapons and for international community to act. According to the World Food Program, nearly half of the population in Sudan, that's 24.6 million human beings, face acute hunger. Famine is confirmed in 10 locations, 8 in North Darfur, including Zamzam Camp, as we often tell you, and 2 in western Nuba Mountains. That was it was first confirmed in Zamzam Camp in August of last year. WFP warns that another 17 areas, including areas of North, South, and East Darfur, the Nuba Mountains, Khartoum, and Al Jazeera, are at risk of famine. The Food Agency is urgently calling for access to be able to preposition food assistance in locations across Sudan, particularly in Darfur, warning that many routes will become impassable during the rainy seasons and communities will just be cut off. Also in Sudan, UNHCR warns that the world's most damaging displacement crisis is now happening amidst the worst humanitarian funding situation in decades. UNHCR notes that less than 10% of its $1.81 billion required has been received for the Sudan situation response in 2025, making it impossible for them to cover the most basic needs. And also on flag on Monday, our guest will be UNHCR's regional director for the East Africa and the Horn of Africa and the Great Lakes, Mamadou Diane Balde. He will brief you virtually on the from Nairobi on the humanitarian situation needs in Sudan and neighboring countries as one of the as we mark the 2-year anniversary. Turning to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs says that clashes in parts of the country's eastern provinces continue to force people out of their homes and hinder humanitarian situation. In South Kivu, heavy fighting between armed groups in the Kalele and Kabare territories yesterday displaced an estimated 11,000 men, women, and children, many of whom are now sheltering with host families. That's what local partners are telling us. They're also reporting that violence has blocked access to the Bukavu-Kalehe road, which is a critical humanitarian corridor. That road has now been blocked for the last 24 hours. Humanitarians stand ready to conduct needs assessment once the security conditions allow it. And moving to neighboring Tanganyika province, local authorities there report that following clashes in Kileme territory, civilians were injured and dozens of homes were burned, with residents fleeing violence, forcing them to go into the bush or neighboring communities. For its part, UNICEF said this morning that reports from child protection colleagues on the ground show children make up between 35 and 45% of the nearly 10,000 cases of rape and sexual violence reported to protection actors in January and February of this year. 10,000 cases. This UNICEF added means that during the most intense phase of the conflict in the east part of the DRC, a child was raped every 30 minutes. The agency is calling for additional prevention efforts, survivor-centered services, and safe and accessible ways for survivors to report without fear. They've also called, obviously, for accountability. More information online. Turning to the situation in Gabon, on the eve of the presidential elections there, the special representative for the Secretary General for Central Africa, Abdou Abari, reiterated his call for an election whose results reflect the choices freely expressed by the Gabonese people following credible, inclusive, and a transparent process. He calls on all those concerned to prioritize dialogue, consultation, and search for consensus and use peaceful means and the relevant institutions to resolve any disagreement or dispute that may arise during the process. As part of his good offices, the special representative reaffirms his readiness to support the Gabonese people in their march towards a return to constitutional order. And in this regard, he welcomes the efforts already made to meet the transition timeline. And turning to Colombia, the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs warns that fighting between non-state armed groups is taking a growing toll on civilians since the start of the year. During the first 3 months of this year, more than 587,000 people have been impacted by confinement due to armed violence by these groups. Entire communities have been barred from leaving their homes to access essential services such as healthcare, food, safe water, and authorities and humanitarian partners have been unable to reach the people in need. We and our partners are doing everything we can to access areas where communities are confined, especially in the Pacific region and along the border with Venezuela. Want to flag that the International Maritime Organization today approved new measures that include fuel standards for ships and a global pricing mechanism for emissions, which is indeed a positive step. These measures set to be formally adopted in October before entry into force in 2027 will become mandatory for large ocean-going ships of over 5,000 gross tons, which emit 85% of the total CO2 emissions from international shipping. The IMO Net Zero Framework is the first in the world to combine mandatory emission limits and greenhouse gas pricing across an entire industry sector. In addition, an IMO Net Zero Fund will be established to collect pricing contributions from emissions. These revenues will then be dispersed to reward low-emission ships and mitigate negative impacts on vulnerable states, such as small island developing states and least developed countries, among other measures. Today on social media, the Secretary General said that as the Jewish community marks the beginning of Passover, his heart breaks for all those whose Seder tables are missing loved ones. Once again, he renews his call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages in Gaza, adding that this be an opportunity to renew our commitment to peace, cooperation, and solidarity. Passover starts tonight. Meanwhile, tomorrow is International Day of Human Spaceflight. Anybody know why April 12th is the International Day of Human Spaceflight? Yes. Thank you to our Russian friend. Okay. It would have been embarrassing if you had not answered that question. The aim of the day is to celebrate each year at the international level the beginning of the space year for mankind, reaffirming the importance of contribution of space science and technology in achieving sustainable development goals and increasing the well-being of states and peoples. And as we said, April 12, 1961 was the date the first human spaceflight carried out by Yuri Gagarin, a Soviet cosmonaut. This historic event opened the way for space exploration. Quiz today, 2 member states paid in full. Jessica, you ready? The first country is the smallest member states in the Middle East with only 780 square kilometers. No, okay, hold on. No. It is also the first country in the Middle East to host a Formula One race. Bahrain. Exactly, Bahrain. Exactly. The next country has a rich coffee heritage and is famous for its high-quality Arabica coffee beans. Brazil? Colombia. So we thank our friends in Manama and in Bogota for having paid up in full. We are now up to 91. Gabriel. I think you were the first one in the room.
There's a report that Tom Fletcher has informed staff at OSHA that they'll be cutting 20% of their staff due to budget shortfalls. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean it's not just a report. I would encourage you to look at the OSHA website, which has a letter from the USG to staff. I think, as he makes it clear, this is due to a cut in funding and not at all to a cut in needs.
And funding specifically from the United States, or is that detailed?
Well, funding from our major donors.
Okay. On a separate topic, the humanitarian office in Geneva. Spokesperson said Israel appears to be inducing on Palestinians in Gaza conditions of life increasingly incompatible with their continued existence as a group in Gaza. Does the Secretary General share that assessment?
I think the Secretary General supports the work of the High Commission for Human Rights, and I think his statement was pretty clear. I'm just going to go down the line here.
Hi, just regarding, Steph, those funding cuts, can you confirm have some of the cuts come from the US? Is the SG worried about
some of the cuts have come from the US, some have come from other countries. I mean, our funding source is very transparent, especially for our humanitarian colleagues.
And on another topic, regarding the case...
Sorry, your microphone's not on. Sorry, go ahead.
Regarding the case of Mahmoud Khalil, we expect a decision in Louisiana today. Does the Secretary General have any response to what's going on regarding deportations in the United States, and in particular the possible targeting of people for their ideas? When pressed for evidence, the US government cited its power to deport people for their beliefs in the case of
Look,
Khalil.
I think a couple of points here. I'm not going to talk about a particular case which is, in fact pending. What we strongly stand for is for the rights of people everywhere to be able to freely express themselves peacefully and without fear of harassment, arrest, detention, or anything. And that goes across the board. And I've said it repeatedly about different situations. On the broader issue, we've always recognized that states have a sovereign right to manage their borders and migration. We just call on all states to do it in a way that respects people's rights and dignity. Ahmed Danidi.
Thank you, Steph. With regard to funding, yesterday we had Sean Hughes from the WFP, World Food Program coordinator in Sudan. And he said that there is a gap of $600 million. And when I asked him about if the U.S. Contributions were suspended for these programs, he said no, all the U.S. programs are still active. What about this gap? And measure on that on different areas, whether it's Myanmar, whether it's Ukraine, or whichever. How the UN deals with it? I mean, is there an emergency fund that
Well,
the
we
UN
can't.
can
I mean,
fold?
let's be honest. We can't print money, and we can't borrow money. So if no money comes in, less aid goes out. It's a very simple formula, right? And this is why I think every day, almost every day, I talk about the humanitarian appeals, and I note how barely funded they are. And this happened before this recent wave of cuts. We've spoken about the heartbreaking decisions that colleagues have to make when it comes down to cutting food rations in refugee camps, right? Which is heartbreaking for them, but is devastating for the people who receive it. We encourage every member state who has the capacity to give, to give. Edie, sorry.
I'm sorry, just to follow up. Do you see it as there is a global fatigue for the ongoing appeals for funding?
Listen, member states have to deal with, make political decisions on funding. We also recognize that they have a responsibility to their own people to cover needs at home. We believe that there is enough money for everything, right? And it needs to be, there is a lot of money in this world. There could be more allocation and more solidarity, and we will continue to call for that. Edie.
Thank you, Steph. First, I wonder if you can tell us why Rebecca Greenspan, the head of the UN Trade Organization, UNCTAD, gave an interview to UN News on the pressing global issues on trade and tariffs, and not to UN journalists either in Geneva or here in New York.
I will pass along your very pertinent comment.
Secondly, on Myanmar, is any aid getting into opposition areas? I know you've just made a lot of comments about fighting still going on, but has anything gotten to those people?
Let me check on the movements, because I know it kind of, it's a moving target. I'd rather not use that word. Deji.
Hi, Steph. Several topics. First, we know that U.S. and Iran is going to have a direct talk tomorrow.
We do.
It seems they tried. Probably they will try to figure out a way to have a nuclear deal. Will UN be ready to help or participate, or UN has the intention to participate?
I think we're getting ahead of ourselves. There's on the nuclear issue, the IEA is in the lead, and I don't want to speak for them, but obviously they have remained very involved in this file, and they continue to do so. On the dialogue that we understand will be happening in Oman tomorrow. We very much hope that this will be a successful venue for Iran and the United States to resolve a lot of the outstanding issues and to help lower the tension between the two countries.
What about JCPOA now, if they met together?
Well, I again, we're not at that table in Oman. I don't want to get ahead of anything. Iran's responsibilities vis-a-vis the IEA remain in place.
Okay, another topic. Since we're talking about the funding issue, couple of months ago, Farhan told us that U.S. own UN money about $2.8 billion, I believe, if I remember correctly. What's the numbers now?
I will check the figures.
But it's
I don't have the figures top of my head.
Right. Okay. So, how is the UN 80 initiative goes now?
It is going.
Are we going to see any?
It is very very much full steam ahead. The the Guy Ryder, who's been appointed by the Secretary General to lead the effort, is leading on the various streams. A lot of interesting proposals are coming forward, and I think within next, well before the General Assembly, we will see some proposals come to light.
So are we going to see like some reports or briefing
Yes,
about
we'll
the
keep
current
we will keep you
situation?
updated. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Let's go to the screen, Mike.
Oh, sir. Firstly, the UN mentioned 2 Jewish holidays in a row. So after never mentioning a Jewish holiday ever. So on behalf of absolutely none of the world's Jews except for me, thank you very much. Secondly, I've got a question for you here. It's a story that I've been tracking for a while. The trip that Special Rapporteur Albanese took to Australia and New Zealand back in November of 23. It took a long time for the UN to respond to this, almost 7 months. But the Human Rights Office told me in July of last year, after we questioned funding for that trip, that, quote unquote, her travel was funded by the UN with respect to her Australia trip. So I thought that was it. They cleared up the matter. It wasn't funded by any Hamas-aligned organizations, as was initially alleged. And that's the story I went with because, silly me, I trusted what they told me. There was a report that came out about a week ago from the Coordination Committee of Special Procedures as part of an OIOS investigation. And that report from the Coordination Committee states that partial external funding for internal travel within Australia and New Zealand was actually part of the equation. So I asked the Human Rights Office to reconcile those two things, what they told me last year and what was in the report about a week ago. And what they told me, reminiscent of Bill Clinton and his, it depends on what the definition of is, they told me that her funding to Australia, literally to Australia, landing at the airport, was funded by the UN, but some of the internal travel within Australia and New Zealand was funded by these external organizations, which they would not name. That, Steph, that's an outright lie by the UN spokespeople, which is very, very unsettling that they would, just complete disinformation that they put out there on this particular subject. So I'm asking you 2 things. Number one, does the Secretary General condemn UN spokespeople disinforming the media in this way? And secondly, does the Secretary General support finally releasing the information surrounding this trip so we can find out who actually funded this anti-Israel tour that the Special Rapporteur took in November of 23?
Happy Passover to you, Mike. I'll go backwards. As you know, the Secretary General has no authority, no oversight of the Ms. Albanese or any of the special rapporteurs' work, funding, etc. She reports to the Human Rights Council. We support transparency in the activities of any official affiliated with the United Nations. On your first part, I have the utmost respect for all of my communications colleagues, and I will look into the matter. Thank you. Gabriel.
Thanks, Steph. On Gaza, I just wanted to make sure that we understand everything correctly, because you brief every day about the situation. Can you just confirm that the way that I understand it is correct assessment? The UN has aid outside of Gaza that is not being allowed in by Israel, number one. The UN has aid inside Gaza that Israel is not allowing the UN to access. And number 3, Israel is continuing to mostly block the majority of requests for the UN to distribute aid in Gaza that you do have.
Okay, so I'll go backwards as well. We have to coordinate with the Israeli security forces movements that take place within the buffer zones, right? As I've said and others have said repeatedly, a vast majority of those movements or blocked when it comes to the distribution of aid. Some of the movements have been allowed when it comes to the movement of people. There is aid that had crossed into Gaza that was in the holding zones that we had talked about a lot in the beginning. We are unable to access that aid, right? And there is aid in the pipeline that's on the other side of Gaza that we're unable to access as well. Okay, thank you all. Happy Friday. Hasta lunes, right? What? Monday, no? Until Monday, yeah. All right. You and I should not speak Spanish. Yeah.